The American soldier who captured 130 Germans. Alone, Chapter 1. The silence after the shells. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet for a battlefield. Smoke drifted like low fog between the blackened trunks. The ground littered with torn packs, rifles, and the bodies of men who had stopped being soldiers only minutes ago. Private First Class Charles Chuck Thompson pressed his back against a splintered pine, his M1 Garand heavy in his hands. He could hear only the soft crackle of burning leaves and the faint hum of distant artillery somewhere to the east. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 24 hours, he would march 130 German prisoners back to American lines, alone. Right now, all he knew was that his platoon had been scattered. The 45th Infantry Division had been pushing through a patch of woodland near the Vosges Mountains, France, late in 1944. Their objective: clear out pockets of German resistance left after the last counterattack. It had seemed like routine mop-up work. Then the ambush came. The first mortar shell had landed squarely on their lead jeep, shredding it into flaming debris. The second shell hit behind them, cutting off retreat. Men screamed. Orders were lost in the thunder of explosions. When the smoke cleared, Chuck found himself alone. The others either dead, wounded, or missing in the thick forest. He checked his canteen. Half full. 2 clips left for the Garand. A Colt .45 in his holster with 1 spare magazine. He had been trained for chaos, but nothing prepared him for this kind of silence. He started moving carefully downhill, toward where he believed the rest of his company had advanced. The November air bit at his face. His boots sank into mud. Each step crunched softly under the weight of fallen branches. A whisper of German voices stopped him cold. He dropped flat into the mud, crawling forward until he could see through the underbrush. Below him in shallow ravine were at least a dozen German soldiers. Gray coats smeared with dirt, rifles slung loosely. They looked exhausted, maybe cut off from their own command. A corporal sat on an ammo box smoking, muttering something about keen funk contact. No radio contact. Chuck's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He was one man. They were 12. Common sense said to back away. But something inside him, call it duty, call it stubbornness, made him stay. He studied them, memorizing positions, noting how one machine gun sat idle near a log, its barrel pointed away. Then he saw it, a white cloth draped over a stick near the corporal's boot. Surrender. Or maybe the start of one. The Germans looked uncertain. Stranded soldiers caught between orders to fight and the growing realization that the war was slipping away from them. Chuck knew the Americans were advancing fast through France. Maybe these men were ready to give up. Maybe he could make them. He waited until the corporal moved a few paces away, then slowly rose from behind the brush, rifle steady. Hands up, he shouted in rough, clipped German. And hot. The sound tore through the silence. Birds scattered from the trees. For a moment, no one moved. Then, astonishingly, one by one, the Germans lifted their hands. Chuck's pulse hammered. What the hell was he doing? He couldn't hold 12 men, not alone. But adrenaline and disbelief carried him forward. He motioned with his rifle, ordering them to line up. His voice trembled, but didn't break. Move. Rich Dunweston. Go. The men obeyed. As he led them through the forest, his mind spun. He knew he should find an American patrol soon, but he didn't dare lose control of the prisoners. And this was only the beginning. In the next few hours, fate would put him in front of dozens more Germans, all desperate, all lost, all ready to surrender to the first soldier who looked like he knew where he was going. And somehow, that soldier would be him. As dusk settled, Chuck Thompson, one man from Oklahoma who joined the army to escape the Dust Bowl, walked westward through the burning woods, 12 prisoners in tow. Behind him, the echo of distant fighting faded into the dark. Ahead, he could see faint flashes of light, maybe American lines. He took a deep breath. Tomorrow, he thought, I'll find my unit. Tomorrow would make him a legend. Chapter 2. A forest full of ghosts. The night crept in fast, smothering the forest in black and silver. Frost gathered on the edges of leaves and helmets, and the breath of every man turned to mist. Chuck Thompson walked at the head of his strange procession, 12 weary German prisoners trudging behind him, their boots squelching softly in the mud. He could hear their muttered voices, low and resigned. None of them had tried to run. Not yet. He couldn't quite believe it himself. A single American private leading a dozen enemy soldiers through enemy-held woods. It was insane. But the Germans seemed as lost as he was. They didn't know where their own lines were anymore, and the front had become a shifting blur of confusion. Sometimes that was how wars ended, not with a battle, but with men too tired to keep fighting. The moonlight glinted off Chuck's rifle as he turned to glance back. One of the Germans, an older sergeant with a gaunt face and a gray beard, caught his eye. The man spoke in careful English. "You are alone, Ja?" Chuck hesitated. "Keep walking." "You are brave," the sergeant said quietly. "Or foolish." "Maybe both," Chuck muttered. They walked on in silence until the trees thinned. The faint crack of gunfire echoed far away, maybe miles off. Somewhere out there, the rest of the 45th Division was still pushing toward the Rhine. He had to reach them. At a small clearing, he stopped to let the men rest. He could barely feel his fingers, pulling his coat tighter. He studied the prisoners under the moonlight, boys barely older than teenagers, a couple of veterans with tired eyes. He saw the exhaustion that went beyond hunger or cold. It was the kind of emptiness soldiers carried after too many days of death. He remembered the ambush, the blast that threw him into the dirt, the screams that followed, the faces of his squad disappearing into smoke. He had been the radio man, and now the radio was gone. There was no way to call for help. He was a ghost in the forest, and these Germans were his haunting. Suddenly, a rustle in the trees snapped his attention. He raised his rifle instantly. "Don't move," he hissed. The prisoners froze. The sound came again, footsteps, cautious but heavy. Chuck crouched low behind a stump, ready to fire. Then a voice called out softly in German. A different voice from deeper in the woods. Chuck's pulse spiked. More of them. Within moments, figures began to emerge between the trees. First 5, then 10, then 20. German soldiers, rifle slung, hands raised high. Their leader, a lieutenant with a bloody bandage on his arm, stepped forward holding a white rag. "We're urging you, INS," he shouted. "We surrender." Chuck blinked. This couldn't be real. 20 more? He looked at the first group, their eyes wide, whispering among themselves. The new arrivals saw the line of prisoners and seemed to take it as proof that this American was leading a whole company somewhere nearby. They dropped their weapons. He stepped forward, trying to hide his shock. "Line up. Move to the clearing." They obeyed. 32 men now. He swallowed hard, forcing authority into his voice. "Anyone tries to run, I shoot." The lieutenant nodded solemnly. "No one will run. The war is finished for us." As the men formed ranks, Chuck's mind raced. He couldn't guard them all. But if they believed he wasn't alone, maybe that would keep them in line. He glanced around for anything useful, a fallen map case, a canteen, a German compass. He tucked them into his pack. He needed direction as badly as food. When dawn broke, a thin fog rolled through the trees. Chuck had barely slept, sitting against a tree with his rifle resting across his knees. The Germans sat in silence, too tired to talk. Somewhere a crow called once and was answered by another. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. He stood, stretching his stiff legs. "Up, we move." They obeyed instantly. Whatever they saw on his face, it was enough to make them follow. Maybe it was the uniform. Maybe the confidence he faked so hard it almost felt real. He just kept moving, one step at a time, praying he was heading west. By mid-morning, they stumbled upon a dirt road winding through the woods. Chuck froze when he spotted tire tracks, American tread marks. Recent ones. His heart leapt. He turned to the prisoners, "Stay here." Moving ahead, he crouched low and followed the road for a few yards. Then he saw them, more Germans. Not a handful this time, but dozens sitting along the ditch, weapons stacked neatly, helmets off. An officer stood near the road, smoking, staring into nothing. Chuck's breath caught. He counted quickly, 40, maybe 50 men. The officer turned at the sound of his boots. When he saw the American uniform, he straightened, then lifted his hands. "American," he called. Chuck nodded, gripping his rifle. "Yeah." The officer let the cigarette drop. "We surrender. All of us." Chuck just stood there, speechless. Behind him, his first group of prisoners watched from the trees. In the pale light, surrounded by silent Germans who had already given up the will to fight, he felt the absurdity of it all crash over him. One man, now commanding nearly 100 prisoners. He swallowed hard, then raised his rifle, pretending calm. "Form a column. March west. Schnell." They obeyed. No hesitation. As they began to move, Chuck Thompson, still just a private, still lost in a French forest, realized something astonishing. The enemy was done fighting. All they needed was someone to tell them which way to go. And somehow, that someone had become him. Chapter 3. The Long Road West. The morning mist clung to the road like breath on glass. Chuck Thompson walked at the front of the line, boots crunching against frozen gravel. Behind him stretched a procession that no one could have imagined. Nearly 100 German prisoners, silent, exhausted, marching in uneven rows. Their rifles were slung over their shoulders upside down, barrels pointed toward the dirt, a quiet sign of defeat. Chuck's fingers trembled on the M1 rifle he carried. His muscles ached from the cold and the tension. Every few minutes he glanced back, half expecting them to turn on him. One shout, one sudden rush, and it would all be over. But none of them did. They followed. Maybe they believed he had a company nearby. Maybe they'd already accepted that their war was over. Whatever the reason, Chuck didn't question it. He just kept walking, eyes fixed on the pale horizon. The forest began to thin. Beyond the last line of trees, open farmland rolled out under the gray sky, frost-covered fields, skeletal fences, and abandoned carts. The war had passed through here weeks ago, leaving behind silence and ruin. Chuck's breath formed small clouds. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. His canteen was almost empty. He could feel his body growing lighter, running on nothing but fear and adrenaline. He motioned for the prisoners to halt. The long line stopped with a shuffle of boots and low murmurs. "Rast," one of the German sergeants barked automatically, and the men sank to the ground. Chuck almost smiled at the irony. They were still soldiers obeying orders, even if those orders came from a stranger in a foreign uniform. He sat on a fallen fence post and pulled a crumpled photograph from his pocket. It was his sister back home in Tulsa, smiling on the porch before he shipped out. Her hair was tied up in a scarf, the way the girls did for factory work. He wondered if she believed this story. Her little brother, a farm boy turned soldier, somehow leading a column of enemy troops through France. A sudden shout broke his thoughts. One of the Germans had stood up, pointing down the road. Farzig, a vehicle. Chuck's heart jumped. He snatched up his rifle and squinted into the distance. Dust, the faint rattle of an engine. For a second, panic flared. Could it be German reinforcements? Then he saw it, a Jeep olive drab, bouncing over the uneven road, a white star on the hood. American. He almost laughed. Relief hit him so hard it made him dizzy. The Jeep slowed, brakes squealing, and two soldiers jumped out, a lieutenant and a driver with a Thompson submachine gun. The lieutenant's jaw dropped when he saw the line of prisoners stretching behind Chuck. "What in God's name?" he breathed. "Private, what the hell is this?" Chuck lowered his rifle and managed a weak grin. "Prisoners, sir." The lieutenant blinked. "How many?" Chuck looked over his shoulder, scanning the endless line. "Hard to say, sir. 100, maybe more. Lost count." The driver let out a low whistle. "You take all these fellas yourself?" Chuck nodded once, still catching his breath. "Guess so." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then the lieutenant burst out laughing. A quick, incredulous laugh that turned into a shake of his head. Well, I'll be damned. He just captured more Krauts than some battalions. He waved to the driver. Get on the radio. Tell HQ we've got a column of POWs headed in. Chuck leaned on his rifle, feeling his legs start to give out. The relief was almost too much to stand. After a day and a night alone, surrounded by enemy soldiers, he was finally looking at friendly uniforms. As the Jeep radio crackled with static, one of the German officers approached carefully, hands raised. Herr Offizier, he said to the lieutenant, my men will cooperate. We are tired. No tricks. The lieutenant nodded sharply. You'll get food and shelter, but first you follow orders. Understood? Yes, sir. Chuck stared at the man, the same one who had surrendered without a fight hours earlier. Their eyes met briefly, and for an instant, Chuck saw something unexpected. Not hatred, not fear, but quiet relief. Both men had survived another day. The lieutenant turned back to Chuck. Private, we'll take it from here, but you'd better get yourself to command. They'll want to hear this story. Chuck hesitated. Permission to stay with the column, sir? The officer raised an eyebrow. Why? Just want to see it through. Chuck said. Feels wrong to hand him off. Halfway. The lieutenant studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, Thompson. You earned it, but stay sharp. So Chuck marched on, this time with an escort jeep rumbling alongside. They passed through broken villages and fields strewn with the wreckage of war, shattered wagons, burned-out trucks, helmets half buried in the mud. The Germans walked quietly, heads low, the sound of their boots echoing across the valley. By the time they reached the outskirts of the American camp, the sun had started to sink behind the hills. Soldiers came out from tents and trucks, staring in disbelief as the column appeared. One American private leading more than 100 enemy troops like some strange, silent parade. Someone whistled. Another laughed. Holy hell, what did you do? Thompson. Charm him into surrendering. Chuck didn't answer. He just kept walking, rifle slung across his shoulder, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion. When they finally reached the holding area, the lieutenant called for the men to halt. Guards moved in to separate and process the prisoners. Chuck stood off to the side, watching as his unlikely captives were herded into barbed wire pens. It was over. For the first time since the ambush, he allowed himself to exhale, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty everything inside him. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of his story. Word was already spreading through camp. Officers were gathering papers in hand, staring at him like he'd stepped out of a legend. And somewhere in that growing murmur of disbelief, he heard the phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life. The soldier who captured 130 Germans alone. Chapter 4. Questions and Cigarettes. By the time Chuck Thompson reached the division command post, the November sun had vanished behind the clouds, leaving the world painted in gray and ash. The air smelled of diesel and wet canvas. Trucks rumbled through the mud. Medics shouted for stretchers. And somewhere in the distance, a chaplain's voice carried over the low murmur of hundreds of tired soldiers. Chuck stood outside a tent marked operations, his uniform torn, face streaked with dried blood and dirt. He looked like any other soldier coming off the line, except for the fact that word about him was spreading faster than wildfire. 2 MPs led him inside. The warmth of the tent hit him first, the heat from a small iron stove, the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke. A captain looked up from a stack of papers. Private Thompson? Yes, sir. Sit down. Chuck sat. His legs felt heavy, almost foreign. The captain studied him for a moment, then glanced at the report on his desk. It says here you brought in approximately 130 enemy prisoners. Alone. Chuck swallowed. Yes, sir. The captain raised an eyebrow. Would you mind telling me how exactly that happened? Chuck rubbed his palms against his knees, searching for the words. Got separated from my unit after the ambush in the woods. Found a small group of Krauts who looked ready to give up. I took them. Then more showed up. They thought I was leading a bigger outfit, I guess. I didn't correct. Just kept moving west till I found our lines. The captain leaned back in his chair, the wooden legs creaking. You didn't threaten them? No firefight? No, sir. He hesitated, realizing how absurd it sounded. Just told them to line up and march. They listened. A soft chuckle came from the corner. An older major, sleeves rolled up, was listening while cleaning his pipe. Oh, son, you talk to them like a preacher or a magician? Chuck shrugged. I guess they'd had enough of the war. The major nodded slowly. Most of them have by now. The captain opened a folder and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with a match that hissed in the quiet. Private, you understand that what you did is highly irregular, but damn impressive. Command wants to know if there was any risk of deception. Did any of the prisoners try to resist? No, sir. They were tired, hungry, just wanted it over. The captain nodded, writing something down. Well, headquarters wants a full written statement. There'll probably be a citation, maybe even a press release. You become quite the story around here. Chuck frowned. A story? The major smiled faintly. You're a hero now, son. A man who took 130 Germans with nothing but guts and a rifle. That's the kind of thing folks back home eat up. Chuck stared at the table. His reflection shimmered faintly in the tin coffee mug sitting nearby. Sir, I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to stay alive. The major tapped his pipe against the table. That's usually how heroes start. Outside, the sound of a generator coughed to life. The tent flap opened and a colonel stepped in tall, with the cold face of someone who'd seen too many reports of death that day. The officers straightened immediately. This the man? The colonel asked. Yes, sir. Private Thompson. The colonel studied him for a long, silent moment. Then he extended his hand. You did good, son. Chuck hesitated, then shook it. The colonel's grip was firm, almost fatherly. You showed initiative and courage. That's what this army's built on. He'll be mentioned in dispatches. Maybe more. Thank you, sir. The colonel nodded once and left without another word. When the flap closed behind him, the captain exhaled slowly. Well, Private, looks like you made history. Chuck gave a small, tired smile. Sir, I'd rather have a hot meal. The officers laughed. The major slid a tin cup of coffee across the table. You earned that too. He took a sip. It was bitter strong, perfect. Hours later, after the paperwork and endless questions, Chuck was given a cot in the corner of the tent. He lay back, staring at the canvas roof fluttering in the wind. Outside, the camp noises faded. Engines idling, boots stomping, men laughing somewhere in the distance. Sleep came in fits. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the forest again, the cold, the silence, the faces of men with their hands raised, surrendering not to him, but to exhaustion itself. When dawn came, a photographer showed up. Orders from HQ, he said. They want a picture of the hero. Chuck groaned, but stood up anyway. They took him outside, where frost still covered the ground. He stood beside the line of German prisoners behind barbed wire, his rifle slung across his shoulder. The photographer adjusted the lens. Hold still, he said. You just made history, soldier. The shutter clicked. The image would later appear in newspapers back home. The young soldier with weary eyes, standing in front of a captured enemy force. The caption would read, The American soldier who captured 130 Germans, alone. But for Chuck, it wasn't pride he felt when he saw the photograph. It was disbelief, and a quiet, haunting question that would follow him long after the war ended. Why him? Why had so many men surrendered to one? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. Chapter 5. Hero in the headlines. 3 days after the capture. The story had spread through the entire 45th Infantry Division like fire racing along dry grass. Soldiers from other regiments came by just to look at him. The kid from Oklahoma who bagged 130 krauts. Some slapped him on the back, some offered him cigarettes. A few just stared as if he were some kind of myth made flesh. Chuck Thompson didn't feel like a hero. He still woke every night hearing the thump of mortars and the groan of dying men. When he closed his eyes, he saw faces. The sergeant with the gray beard, the lieutenant with the blood-stained bandage, the ones who had followed him wordlessly through the fog. They weren't villains, just soldiers who had run out of war. At the mess tent, he ate quietly, listening to the rumors swirl. They're saying the brass wants him for the Stars and Stripes. Maybe even Life magazine. Hell, next thing you know, he'll be back, home shaking the president's hand. Chuck kept his head down. The food tasted like paper. Later that afternoon, a jeep rolled up outside his company area. A reporter stepped out, a civilian in a battered trench coat, a press tag pinned to his lapel. His hair was slicked back, his face gaunt from weeks near the front. He spotted Chuck instantly. "You Thompson?" "Yes, sir." "Name's Howard Ellis, Associated Press. Mind if I ask a few questions?" Chuck hesitated. "Orders." Ellis grinned. "From the top, son, they want your story told." They sat on an overturned ammunition crate, while Ellis lit a cigarette and flipped open a notebook. "All right, start from the beginning. What went through your mind when you realized you were surrounded by Germans?" Chuck rubbed his temples. "Honestly, I wasn't thinking much at all. I just didn't want to die." Ellis chuckled softly. "That's a fine line, Thompson, between not wanting to die and doing something insane. So you just walked up and told them to surrender?" "Pretty much. They looked like they were done fighting. I gave them a direction, and they followed." The reporter scribbled, eyes gleaming. "Beautiful. Pure Americana. One man, one rifle, and guts." Chuck frowned. "It wasn't guts, Mr. Ellis. It was luck. They could have shot me easy." Ellis didn't look up. Readers don't like luck. They like courage. That night the article went out through field radio transmission, edited somewhere in Paris and sent to every paper stateside. When the first copies reached the front a week later, soldiers gathered around the bulletin board outside the mail tent. The headline read, "Oklahoma farm boy captures 130 Nazis alone." Underneath was a grainy photo of Chuck standing with his rifle, the faint smile frozen by exhaustion. Men cheered and clapped him on the back. Someone shouted, "Hey, Thompson, autograph my mess tin." He forced a smile, but inside he felt hollow. The article made it sound like he'd stormed a bunker or outshot 100 men. It left out the cold, the confusion, the faces of surrender. It turned war into a campfire tale. 2 days later he was called to headquarters again. Colonel Merritt handed him a freshly typed order. "You're being rotated to division rear for a few weeks, Private. Command wants you to speak at a couple of morale events. Shake hands, tell the story. You'll get good food and clean sheets for once." Chuck blinked. "Sir, I'd rather stay with my unit." The colonel's expression softened. "I know, but orders are orders. Besides, the boys out there could use a reminder that courage still counts." So he went. In the rear area near Epinal, tents were strung with electric bulbs, and the air smelled of coffee instead of cordite. Chuck stood on makeshift stages before rows of tired soldiers, repeating the same story again and again. Each time it grew shorter, cleaner, easier to tell, until even he began to sound like the article that bore his name. "Found a group of Germans ready to quit," he'd say. "Told them to march west." More joined in. By the time I saw our lines, I had over 100. Men laughed, applauded, whistled. After one talk, a sergeant approached him privately. "Hell of a thing you did, kid. But tell me straight, you weren't scared?" Chuck looked at him for a long moment. "I still am." That night he sat outside his tent, staring at the stars. The sound of distant artillery rolled like thunder over the horizon. The war was still there, grinding on, swallowing men he'd trained with, men whose names would never make the papers. He took the newspaper clipping from his pocket. The headline seemed almost obscene now, a few black words trying to summarize everything that had happened. He folded it carefully and slid it back into his jacket. He thought of the German lieutenant with the wounded arm. Did the man survive the march? Was he already on a ship bound for a POW camp in America, or buried somewhere under the frost? Chuck didn't know. All he knew was that somewhere out there, other men were still fighting, still dying, while he was being turned into a story. The next morning, a photographer from the Signal Corps found him packing his gear. Orders changed again, the man said. They're sending you back to the line. You've done your talking. Chuck nodded, a strange relief washing through him. Back where I belong, then? Yeah, the photographer said. But don't get yourself killed. The papers already made you famous. Wouldn't do to spoil the ending. Chuck gave a faint smile. I'll try not to. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and climbed onto the back of a supply truck headed east, toward the smoke rising on the horizon. The cheers and headlines faded behind him. Ahead waited the real war, mud, fear, and the sound of men trying to hold their ground in a world gone mad. As the truck bounced along the frozen road, he whispered to himself, no heroes out there, just survivors. And with that, the legend of the soldier who captured 130 Germans moved from paperback into flesh and blood. Chapter 6, Back to the Line. The truck rattled and groaned as it bounced along the frozen road east of Epinal. Canvas flaps whipped in the wind, carrying the smell of diesel and wet earth. Around Chuck sat a dozen soldiers heading back to the front, some replacements, some men returning from wounds or rest. Their faces were hard, unreadable. No one spoke much. They all knew what waited ahead. The war had shifted again. Word was the Germans were preparing a massive counterattack somewhere up north in the Ardennes, but down here in Alsace, the 45th Division was pushing toward the Rhine. The air buzzed with the tension of men who knew the end was close, but not close enough to stop killing for. Chuck stared at his boots. The mud caked on the soles from a dozen places that already felt like another lifetime. The paper hero, he thought. That's what they saw when they looked at him now. The American soldier who captured 130 Germans alone. The brass had sent him back to his company with a handshake and a medal recommendation. He would have traded it all for a night without dreams. When the truck stopped, he jumped down into the mud. The cold cut through his coat like knives. He recognized the landscape, the same pines, the same gray sky. Only the smell of smoke told him the front had moved east. Thompson. He turned. Sergeant Miller was striding toward him, his helmet tilted, a cigar stub clenched in his teeth. Well, look what the wind blew back from the rear echelon. Chuck smiled faintly. Good to see you too, Sarge. Miller gave him the once-over. Heard about your little stunt. You planning to catch the rest of the Wehrmacht while you're at it? Only if they line up nice and quiet again. Miller barked a laugh, clapping him on the shoulder. Oh, Thompson, I'll take you on patrol any day. The camp was little more than a cluster of foxholes, a few tents, and a half-buried command post. Artillery thundered miles away, low and steady. Chuck dropped his pack beside the others and went to work like nothing had changed, cleaning his rifle, boiling coffee in a tin cup, listening to the endless radio chatter about movements, supplies, losses. At dusk, orders came down night patrol, east sector. Miller gathered the squad around a flickering lantern. Intel says Krauts are pulling back from the river. Could be stragglers. Could be an ambush. We go light and quiet. Chuck checked his weapon, feeling the familiar rhythm return, the calm before danger, the ritual of action. For the first time since his capture of the prisoners, he felt like a soldier again, not a story. They moved out under a moon thin as a knife. The forest was cold and black, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound. Frost crunched under boots. Somewhere far off, a flare burst and faded. Half an hour in, Miller raised a fist. The column froze. Ahead, faint whispers drifted through the trees. German, low and uncertain. Chuck's pulse jumped. He crept forward, heart hammering. Through the brush, he saw them. A group of 5 enemy soldiers crouched around a fire made from splintered boards. Their rifles lay nearby. They looked young, terrified, hungry. Miller's breath came hot against Chuck's ear. Orders? Chuck hesitated. The memory hit him. The first surrender, the raised hands, the disbelief that followed. He exhaled slowly. I'll handle it, he whispered. Before Miller could stop him, he stepped into the clearing, rifle leveled. Hand hot. The words hung in the night. The Germans froze, eyes wide. One of them dropped his tin cup with a clatter. Chuck's voice was steady now, stronger than he felt. Drop your weapons. Slowly. The soldiers exchanged glances. Then, as if history was repeating itself, they obeyed. One by one, they raised their hands. Miller and the others burst into the clearing, guns ready. Disbelief written across their faces. "Well, I'll be damned," Miller muttered. "You did it again." The men tied the prisoners' hands and led them back through the forest. It was quick, almost bloodless. Back at camp, as they handed the captives to the MPs, one of the new replacements stared at Chuck like he was some kind of sorcerer. "How'd you do that, man? You scare 'em or what?" Chuck shook his head. They were already scared. That night, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The forest beyond the perimeter was silent again, the way it had been before everything started. Miller sat down beside him, offering a cigarette. "You've got a strange kind of luck, Thompson. You ever think about that?" Chuck took the smoke, lit it, and let the silence hang. Every day, they sat there until the fire burned low. Two soldiers surrounded by ghosts, German, American, all the same now, just names fading in the cold. When dawn came, snow began to fall, light at first, then thick, covering everything in quiet white. The world looked almost peaceful, but as the artillery started again in the distance, Chuck knew better. Peace was still far away. He crushed the cigarette into the snow and stood. The day's orders were already coming down the line. Advance east. No time for heroes. No time for rest. Just another day in a war that refused to end. Chapter 7. The River That Burned. Snow fell all night, blanketing the trenches in a dull white glow. By dawn, the world looked silent and almost beautiful, until the artillery started again. The thunder rolled from the east, shaking the ground underfoot. Snow burst from the trees in clouds each time a shell landed nearby. Chuck Thompson crouched in a shallow foxhole, hands numb inside soaked gloves. The breath from his men rose like smoke. Sergeant Miller leaned against the wall of the trench, map spread across his knee. His cigar stub somehow still lit in the wind. "Orders just came in," Miller said. "We move at 0900. Divisions crossing the Sour River, pushing toward Lauterburg. Krauts are dug in deep on the far bank, but we're going through anyway." Chuck nodded. "How bad the intel?" "Bad enough." Miller folded the map. "They've got machine guns, mortars, maybe a few tanks. We've got air support if the weather holds, but it won't." The men around them were silent. No one needed to say it. The river crossings were always the worst. Open ground, nowhere to hide. Water cold enough to kill before a bullet did. At 0855, the whistle blew. The snow, the fear, the noise. Everything vanished into one rush of movement. Men climbed from their holes, rifles slung, boots sliding on ice. Chuck followed Miller, head low, the wind cutting like glass. Ahead, the Sour glimmered black and fast, chunks of ice twisting in the current. The engineers had thrown up a few makeshift bridges overnight, little more than planks and rope. Mortar shells began to fall before the first squad even reached them. Water exploded upward in great columns. Chuck felt the shock wave of one blast throw him to his knees. Mud and snow rained down. Someone screamed nearby, short and sharp. He crawled forward, grabbed the edge of the bridge, and started across. Halfway over, a round tore through the boards ahead of him. He froze, heart hammering, then forced himself to move again. Behind him, Miller shouted, "Go, go, go!" When his boots hit the far bank, Chuck dove behind a frozen log, gasping for breath. The air reeked of smoke and river water. Bullets snapped through the trees. He saw them then, gray uniforms moving through the haze. The Germans firing from foxholes along the ridge. "Get that bar up," Miller roared. Private Gonzalez dropped beside Chuck, his Browning automatic rifle chattering to life. The sound was deafening in the narrow valley. Chuck fired beside him, the rifle jerking in his hands. Snow sprayed from the impacts up the hill. For what felt like hours, they traded fire inching forward yard by yard. The river behind them churned red in places where men had fallen. Then, through the chaos, a voice called in English, thick with an accent. "Americaner, stop shooting. We surrender." Chuck blinked. Through the drifting smoke, he saw a small group of Germans, maybe a dozen, stepping out from behind a ruined stone wall, rifles raised above their heads. Miller swore, "Not this again." Chuck lowered his weapon slightly. "Hold fire." The rest of the line hesitated. The Germans kept their hands high. Some looked barely old enough to shave. Miller glanced at Chuck. "Well, Thompson, looks like you still got that magic." Chuck ignored the jab, standing slowly, motioning with his rifle. "Come and see here. Hands stay up." The men stumbled forward, shivering, faces pale with exhaustion. One of them slipped on the ice, dropping to his knees. Chuck moved quickly to help him up. The boy couldn't have been more than 16. When they reached the American lines, the MPs came running, herding the prisoners back toward the rear. Miller shook his head. "Unbelievable. They'd rather walk into your arms than keep fighting." Chuck didn't answer. He was staring at the river, at the dead floating past, at the blood swirling through the water like red ink. The surrender didn't feel like victory. It felt like the world had finally run out of sense. By nightfall, the ridge was theirs. Fires burned among the shattered trees, and medics moved through the snow like ghosts, collecting the wounded. Chuck sat on an ammo crate, drinking tepid coffee, his rifle across his knees. 2 new replacements approached, young, nervous, eyes wide. One of them whispered, "That's him, the one from the papers." Chuck pretended not to hear, but they came closer. "Hey, Private Thompson," the taller one said. "That story true? You really took all those Germans by yourself?" He sighed. "That's what they say." The shorter one grinned. "Man, you got to teach us how you do that. You just yell and they give up?" The words stung more than they should have. Chuck stood slowly, slinging his rifle. "No, kid, I just got lucky. That's all." He walked away before they could say anything else. Later, as he sat alone at the edge of the camp, the moon reflected on the river like a strip of broken glass. Somewhere down the bank, the surrendered Germans huddled in silence, guarded by a pair of Americans. The war felt endless, a machine grinding men to dust and then asking for more. Chuck stared at his trembling hands, at the mud under his nails, and thought, maybe they were right. Maybe I was foolish, not brave. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of burning oil. It reminded him of home, of tractors and wheat fields, of a life that felt as distant as the stars above. He exhaled, the breath curling white into the cold night. Tomorrow they would move again. Another village, another river, another headline waiting to be written by someone who'd never fired a shot. But tonight, there was only the snow, the dark, and the ghosts of those who'd chosen surrender over death. Chapter 8. The Doubters. The border was just a line on a map, but to the men who crossed it that December morning, it felt like stepping into another world. Snow lay deep along the roadside, muffling the sound of boots and engines. The sign they passed, "Willkommen in Deutschland," was riddled with bullet holes. Beyond it, the first German village smoldered under a gray sky. Chuck Thompson trudged forward with his squad, rifle tight in his hands. The streets were empty, the windows shattered, the air thick with the smell of smoke and fear. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. "Feels different here," Private Gonzalez muttered beside him. "Like even the air's mean." Sergeant Miller glanced back. "Stay sharp. The Krauts'll fight harder on their own ground." They advanced through the village, house by house. Every doorway, every cellar might hide a rifle. The war had shrunk now from grand offensives to corners and alleys, to the space between one breath and the next. At the far end of town, they found a half-collapsed barn. Inside, huddled near the remains of fire, were 3 old men and a woman clutching a child. Civilians, terrified. Miller lowered his weapon first, motioning for the others to stand down. Chuck's German was rough, but enough. "We're ton in nix. Kane, angst. "We won't hurt you. Don't be afraid." The woman nodded quickly, eyes wide, whispering thanks. The child looked no older than 6, face streaked with soot. Chuck handed him a piece of chocolate from his rations. The boy stared, then took it carefully, as if it might vanish. Outside, the snow began to fall again. By nightfall, the village was secured. The men built fires among the ruins, cooked what they could find, and tried to forget where they were. Chuck sat on a broken step, sipping cold coffee, when Miller approached with a folded paper. "HQ wants you up at the command post," he said. "Now." Chuck frowned. "What for?" "Don't know, but I bet it ain't a medal this time." The command post was set up in what used to be a schoolhouse, chalk still on the blackboard, a map of Europe curling on the wall. Inside, 2 officers stood over a table littered with documents. One was a captain Chuck didn't know. The other wore a major's insignia and an expression carved from stone. "Private Thompson?" the major asked without looking up. "Yes, sir." "Sit." Chuck obeyed. The room smelled of stale smoke and damp wool. The major glanced at the papers. "You're the one who supposedly captured 130 Germans alone, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Supposedly." The word landed sharp. "You see, Private, there's been discussion. Some reports don't add up. No witnesses from your platoon. No verification of numbers. Just your account and a few officers' assumptions." Chuck stared at him. "Sir, I don't know what to tell you. It happened." The captain crossed his arms. "Convenient, considering every other man from your patrol was either missing or killed. You expect us to believe one private marched an entire company of Wehrmacht through the woods without a single casualty." "It wasn't a company," Chuck said quietly. "It was groups, scattered, lost. They came to me." The major snorted. "They came to you? That's quite a tale, son. Sound more like something out of a pulp magazine than a field report." Chuck's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, I didn't ask for the story. I was just trying to survive." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then the captain leaned forward. "Headquarters is under pressure to clean up the propaganda. If we're building heroes, they want them verifiable. So we're checking. Don't take it personal." Chuck swallowed hard. "Sir, I'm not asking to be a hero." The major's expression softened slightly. "Then you've got nothing to worry about. Dismissed." Chuck stood, saluted, and left. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of burnt wood and oil. He walked through the ruined streets until he found Miller by the fire again. "How'd it go?" Miller asked. Chuck sat beside him, staring into flames. "They think I made it up." Miller grunted. "Figures. Nobody believes anything unless it comes with paperwork." "They want proof," Chuck said quietly. "But all the proof's buried somewhere in those woods." The sergeant took a drag from his cigar. "You know what, kid? Doesn't matter. We were there. We fight today, we fight tomorrow. Paper heroes come and go. The mud doesn't care." Chuck nodded, though the words didn't ease the knot in his chest. He'd faced German guns without shaking, but sitting in front of those officers, being called a liar, that had hurt in a different way. Later that night, as the men drifted off to sleep, Chuck lay awake under a tarp, listening to the wind whistle through broken walls. Somewhere in the dark, he could hear the distant thump of artillery, the rhythm of a war that didn't pause for reputation or truth. He thought of the Germans who'd surrendered, of the faces turned toward him in the cold. Every one of them had been real, every one breathing proof. And yet, to the men behind the desks, it was just a story to manage, a headline to polish or discard. He turned on his side, the snow melting against his cheek, and whispered to no one. "I was there. I know what happened." But the wind carried the words away, lost among the ruins of a country that no longer believed in anything. Not victory, not truth, not even heroes. Chapter 9. The Fire in Neustadt. The smoke rose over Neustadt like a black crown against the gray morning sky. Artillery shells still fell on the outskirts, shaking the streets and sending shutters clattering. Chuck Thompson adjusted his helmet and crawled forward with Miller and the rest of the squad, their boots slipping in mud and icy water. "Eyes open," Miller whispered, scanning the shattered buildings. Krauts could be anywhere. Chuck nodded. The village was eerily silent now. The only sound the distant thrum of artillery and the soft splash of frozen puddles under boots. Every broken window, every collapsed roof hid a potential ambush. The earlier surrender of stragglers seemed like another world. Here, the Germans fought to the last. They reached the center square. Smoke from burning vehicles curled into the sky. A tank hull lay on its side, mangled, a twisted monument to a battle that had passed before their arrival. From the corner of his eye, Chuck saw movement, a shadow darting between the rubble. Contact. Miller hissed. Rifles cracked. Chuck dove behind a low wall, bullets splintering stone around him. He returned fire, squeezing the trigger in short bursts. The Germans were well positioned, using buildings for cover, firing from second floors and basements. A sudden scream tore through the square. A civilian trapped between lines. Chuck's stomach twisted. Without thinking, he bolted, dragging the man into cover as rounds chipped the bricks around them. "You're crazy," Miller yelled, dragging his own rifle alongside him. "I've done crazier," Chuck shouted, adrenaline burning off exhaustion. They pressed on, house to house, the squad splitting to flank the defenders. Chuck moved with practiced precision, eyes scanning windows, doorways, and alleyways. Every shadow was a threat. Every silence screamed danger. Then he saw them, a group of German soldiers trying to retreat through a side street. They hadn't noticed him yet. Chuck's pulse surged. No thought, no hesitation. He raised his rifle and called out, "Hand hock." This time, though, some turned and fired. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, one grazing Chuck's shoulder. Pain flared, but he kept moving, forcing them back toward Miller's position. With a combination of shouting and flanking maneuvers, they corralled the group into the square. 30 Germans surrendered this time, more than Chuck had hoped for. His squad secured them while he leaned against a wall, breathing hard, bleeding lightly. Miller came up beside him, clapping him on the back. "You're not lucky this time. You're a force of nature." Chuck shook his head. "I'm just trying to survive." The sound of a German machine gun erupted from a second-floor window. Tracer rounds stitched the air around them. Chuck dropped, sliding into a side alley, dragging a wounded private with him. He counted shots, calculated angles, and returned fire. By the time Miller caught up, the machine gun was silent. A shot to the barrel had ended it. By late afternoon, Neustadt was in American hands. Fires burned in the streets, and the smell of smoke and gunpowder lingered like a warning. Command radios crackled with reports of resistance pockets. But Chuck and Miller's squad had done more than expected. They had taken prisoners, neutralized snipers, and secured key buildings. Yet the victory felt hollow. Bodies lay in every street. Civilians emerged, wary and frightened. Chuck helped them to shelter, distributing what rations they had. Every face he saw reflected the same truth. This war spared no one. Later in the command post, Chuck was summoned again. This time, the faces he met were different. Generals observing the battle, noting reports of captures and engagements. One of them finally looked him squarely in the eye. "Private Thompson," the officer said, voice even, "your actions in Neustadt, they've been verified by multiple units. Your record now speaks for itself." Chuck nodded, but didn't smile. "Sir, it wasn't about glory, just doing my job." The officer's gaze lingered. "Sometimes, Private, doing your job looks like legend." As Chuck stepped back into the ruined streets, the snow turning red at the edges, he realized something had changed. The doubters in the command tents would now have to accept the truth. He wasn't just a story. He was a soldier who had faced impossible odds and survived. But as he looked toward the smoke rising from the next block, toward more buildings to clear, more men to face, Chuck knew one thing clearly. Legend or not, the war wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Chapter 10. Counterstrike at Dawn. The wind howled through Neustadt like a living thing, carrying smoke, ash, and the metallic tang of blood. Dawn broke in a pale gray light, illuminating streets scarred by yesterday's battle. Chuck Thompson crouched behind a crumbling wall, rifle in hand, staring down the main avenue. His squad fanned out beside him, alert and tense. "Intel said they'd try something today," Miller muttered, scanning the rooftops with binoculars. "Looks like they're on time." Chuck didn't answer. His jaw was tight, mind already running through angles and escape routes. The Germans were disciplined, ruthless, and desperate. After losing Neustadt, a counterattack was inevitable. He could hear the distant rumble of engines and the faint clatter of tracked vehicles over broken cobblestones. "Contact!" shouted Private Gonzalez, pointing toward the eastern edge of the town. Chuck raised his rifle and froze. Smoke plumes obscured their approach, but movement betrayed them. Dozens of German soldiers, advancing in formation, tanks in tow. They were outnumbered, but the enemy moved with coordination that made hesitation lethal. Miller barked orders. "Split up, houses on the left, sniper positions on the right. Thompson covered the center." Chuck moved fast, slipping between debris and shattered carts, rifle trained on the advancing soldiers. Every instinct screamed that this was different, the stakes higher, the margin for error gone. The first shots rang out from an upper window. A German rifleman picked off a member of Miller's squad. Chuck fired in return, dropping a soldier before he could take another. He signaled Gonzalez to flank the right side, forcing the enemy into a narrow alley. The counterattack was coordinated, but Chuck had the advantage of terrain. Every corner, every wall, every burned-out car could be a trap. Artillery began hammering Neustadt from the hills beyond. Shells exploded near the main square, shaking buildings and sending rubble raining down. Chuck pushed forward, yelling to his men, directing them toward defensible positions. He realized that survival here would demand both speed and cunning. Through smoke and chaos, he spotted the enemy tank attempting to flank. A half-second decision. Chuck grabbed a satchel of explosives from their cache, ran across the street, and lobbed it onto the tank's tracks. The explosion ripped through metal, halting the vehicle and sending soldiers scrambling for cover. "Thompson, are you crazy?" Miller shouted over the din, his voice raw with disbelief. Chuck didn't answer. He was already moving, corralling the enemy infantry into the streets where his men could cover crossfire. The Germans were disciplined, but they underestimated him. One by one, groups of them surrendered, raising hands, shaking in the freezing morning air. Chuck felt no triumph, only a cold calculation. Keep surviving, keep directing, keep moving. By midday, the counterattack had faltered. The streets were littered with debris bodies and the wreckage of armored vehicles. Chuck and his squad had taken over 70 prisoners, more than they could manage. He directed them into a secure building, guarded by reinforcements arriving from the rear. Finally, as the afternoon light slanted over the broken town, Chuck allowed himself to breathe. He slumped against a wall, the weight of adrenaline and exhaustion pressing down. His hands shook as he cleaned his rifle, and for the first time, he let himself notice the horror around him. Burned-out houses, shattered lives, frightened civilians peering from windows. Miller crouched beside him, lighting a cigar. "You did good, kid. No, more than good. You saved us." Chuck shook his head. "I don't feel like a hero. I feel like I barely made it." Miller shrugged. "Heroes don't always feel like heroes. And sometimes surviving is the bravest thing anyone can do." Chuck's gaze drifted to the prisoners lined up along the square, their faces pale, eyes wary. The war had forced them into the same calculation he had made countless times. Surrender or die. He thought of the earlier story of 130 Germans walking into his hands. Now he understood it better. It wasn't luck or bravado. It was opportunity, strategy, and understanding fear. The commander arrived later that day, surveying the battlefield. He paused near Chuck, nodding grimly. "Your actions in Neustadt, and this morning, they've been reported up the chain. You're not just a private anymore. You're an example of initiative under fire." Chuck's lips tightened. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." The commander studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, He walked away. Chuck remained crouched, staring at the ruined streets, aware that each victory carried a cost, and each victory was only temporary. As night fell, the fires of Neustadt smoldered, casting long shadows. Chuck sat with his squad, passing rations and listening to the wind whisper through shattered buildings. He knew more battles lay ahead, more towns to clear, more rivers to cross. But for the first time, he also understood something crucial. Survival required not just courage, but calculated action, the ability to read men and terrain, and the relentless will to move forward when everything screamed to stop. The war was far from over, but for now, Chuck Thompson had survived the counterstrike at dawn. And in that survival, he found a grim, quiet measure of victory. Chapter 11. Crossing the Rhine. The Rhine stretched before them like a steel ribbon, gray and relentless, its waters swollen by the melting snow and recent rains. Chuck Thompson stood on the riverbank with his squad, staring at the dark current, the fog rolling in from the opposite shore. Beyond the mist, they knew, lay more than just water. It lay behind the heart of Germany, the enemy's final defenses before the industrial cities and the road to Berlin itself. Artillery thundered somewhere upriver, shaking the earth beneath their boots. Engineers scrambled to assemble pontoons, laying the fragile vessels across ice-slick logs and makeshift bridges. Every second counted. German patrols could strike at any moment, and the current was strong enough to sweep a man away in an instant. Miller crouched beside Chuck. "You ready for this, kid?" he asked, eyes scanning the opposite shore. Chuck nodded, though his stomach twisted. "As ready as I'll ever be. Let's just keep our heads." The first wave moved. Soldiers in the pontoons, rifles ready, pushed off into the frigid water. The current tugged at their legs like a living thing, threatening to overturn the flimsy boats. From the fog came distant gunfire, tracer rounds arching over the surface like dangerous fireflies. Chuck gritted his teeth. "We stick together. No hesitation." They boarded the second raft, balancing carefully. Each ripple, each splash of icy water sent shivers through him. Halfway across, a German machine gun opened up from a bunker on the far bank. Bullets peppered the water around them, tearing splinters from the wood, splashing cold water into the faces of the soldiers. "Hit the dirt." Miller yelled. Chuck leaned low, returning fire as best he could from the raft, the current rocking them like a cradle of chaos. Behind him, a private fell overboard, gasping and thrashing. Chuck lunged, grabbing his arm and pulling him back, the cold burning through his gloves and into his bones. By some miracle or sheer will, they made it across. Chuck's raft slammed into the far shore, soaked and shaking, but alive. Around him, men scrambled for cover behind sandbags and ruined walls. The Germans fired sporadically, but the river crossing had taken them by surprise. Chuck advanced cautiously, rifle raised, guiding his squad through debris-strewn streets toward a small bridge that led further inland. Each step was calculated, each movement measured. He realized that what had been chaos on the Rhine was now opportunity, and they had to act fast before the enemy regrouped. A sudden shout, German soldiers attempting to flank them from a ruined warehouse. Chuck fired, then sprinted, dragging a wounded comrade behind a collapsed wall. He saw Miller covering him, the sergeant's face grim, eyes blazing with concentration. Together, they pinned the attackers, forcing the remaining Germans to retreat. As night fell, Chuck's squad had secured a small foothold on the far side of the Rhine. Fires burned along the bank, illuminating the mist, while distant artillery painted the sky in orange flashes. The soldiers were exhausted, cold, and soaked, yet their spirits held. They had achieved what seemed impossible, a river crossing under fire. Chuck collapsed against a rock, shivering, listening to the water rush past. In the quiet moments between gunfire and artillery, he reflected on everything that had led him here. Surrendering Germans, firefights in ruined towns, the counterattack at Neustadt. And yet, crossing the Rhine felt different. It was not just survival, now it was a statement. A foothold in enemy territory. A bridge toward the end of the war. Miller came over, handing him a canteen. You know, he said quietly, you keep doing things like this, they're going to start calling you a legend. Chuck shook his head, taking a long drink. I'm just a private trying to keep his squad alive. Miller chuckled softly, the sound a brief warmth against the cold night. Sometimes surviving and keeping your men alive is legendary. The soldiers settled into makeshift positions, watching the dark water behind them and the unknown land ahead. Chuck looked toward the horizon, aware that more battles, more dangers, and more unimaginable choices lay between them and victory. The Rhine had been crossed, but the war was far from over. And deep down, he knew that the next decision he made could either save lives or cost them all. The night closed in and Chuck Thompson, soaked, exhausted, and determined, stayed vigilant. Because the war was teaching him something crucial. Courage alone was never enough. Strategy, instinct, and nerve, that combination was what made a soldier survive when everything else seemed impossible. Chapter 12. The Streets of Koblenz. The streets of Koblenz were a labyrinth of stone and shadow, a city scarred by months of bombardment and siege. Smoke hung low over the rooftops, mingling with the early morning mist, turning every silhouette into a potential threat. Chuck Thompson crouched behind the remains of a bombed-out truck, scanning the avenue ahead. His squad moved silently beside him, senses stretched tight, rifles at the ready. Intel said they've got snipers on every corner, Miller whispered, peering over the rubble. Keep your heads down. Chuck nodded, adjusting the strap on his rifle. This wasn't just another town. Koblenz was a strategic hub, its bridges and factories vital to German supply lines. Holding it would cut off reinforcements and pave the way for the Allied advance deeper into the heart of the Reich. But the Germans weren't about to surrender it without a fight. They advanced cautiously, moving from cover to cover. Every street was a gauntlet. Windows and doorways, shattered or intact, could conceal enemy soldiers ready to fire without warning. Chuck's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the sharp awareness that a single misstep could cost lives. Suddenly a shot rang out. Private Gonzalez yelped and dropped behind a wall, but Chuck reacted instantly. He raised his rifle, firing in short, controlled burst toward the window above a collapsed bakery. Another German soldier fell, and the street was momentarily silent again. Miller motioned toward a narrow side street. We flank them. Keep it quiet and move fast. Chuck led the way, his mind calculating the angles, the lines of sight, the possible traps. He had learned over the past weeks that combat wasn't just about firepower. It was about reading the terrain, predicting enemy behavior, and using fear as a weapon. As they turned the corner, Chuck froze. A group of Germans, about a dozen strong, had set up a makeshift barricade, rifles ready. He signaled to Miller, who nodded. They needed to neutralize them without drawing more attention. Listen up, Chuck whispered. We split. You two on the left, Gonzalez and I on the right. We move slowly. Keep your weapons ready, but no shots until I signal. They crept along the ruined walls, inching closer. Chuck's pulse was steady. Every sense was tuned to the smallest movement. When they were within striking distance, he raised his hand and nodded. The squad fired almost simultaneously, catching the Germans off guard. Within seconds, the resistance was neutralized, and the survivors were disarmed and corralled. Chuck felt no elation, only the grim satisfaction of strategy executed flawlessly. Move up, he ordered. We secure the next block. The rest of the morning passed in a tense blur of clearing buildings, disarming snipers, and directing prisoners into makeshift holding areas. Chuck's leadership became instinctive, his orders precise and efficient. Every building cleared brought a mix of relief and caution. One wrong decision could still trigger a deadly ambush. By noon, they had secured a significant portion of Koblenz. The squad took a brief respite, tending to the wounded and surveying the streets they had cleared. Chuck's mind, however, was already calculating the next moves. He knew this foothold could be exploited, but only if they maintained discipline and initiative. A sudden shout drew his attention. A group of Germans attempting to regroup and break through a side street. Chuck acted without hesitation. He grabbed a flare and fired it into the air, signaling to nearby Allied forces and creating the illusion of reinforcements. Confused, the German soldiers froze, then surrendered one by one, their morale shattered. Miller clapped Chuck on the shoulder. "Kid, that was brilliant. You're making a habit of turning chaos into order." Chuck shook his head, glancing at the prisoners and the ruined streets. "It's not brilliance. It's survival and understanding fear. They're scared or organized. That's enough to win sometimes." As night fell over Koblenz, fires flickered across the rooftops, casting long shadows over the ruined streets. Chuck sat quietly on a broken wall, exhausted but alert, aware that tomorrow could bring new challenges. He had learned that victory in a city wasn't just about bullets and grenades. It was about leadership, timing, and exploiting every small advantage. In the back of his mind, a thought lingered. The lessons he learned here in Koblenz would shape what he would do in the days to come. Actions so daring, so audacious, that soldiers and generals alike would later call them impossible. Chuck Thompson wasn't yet a legend, but in the ruined streets of Koblenz, he was laying the groundwork for the moment that would define him. Chapter 13. The Calm Before the Trap. The dawn light spilled over Koblenz like pale gold, glinting off broken glass and twisted metal. The streets were quieter now, the initial chaos of battle giving way to a tense, uneasy calm. Chuck Thompson sat atop a rubble-strewn wall, notebook in hand, sketching the positions of German forces he had observed the previous day. Each mark represented a soldier, a patrol route, a machine gun nest, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Miller joined him, coffee tin steaming in hand. "You really planning to take notes on every crowd in the city?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Chuck didn't look up. "I need to know exactly what we're facing. If we want to avoid another firefight like yesterday, we have to think ahead. And if we want to do something big, we have to understand fear and leverage it." Miller frowned, sensing the intensity in Chuck's tone. "Big, huh? You mean like really big?" Chuck finally glanced at him. His eyes were sharp, almost unnervingly calm. "Yes, I've been thinking about how we can make them surrender without a long fight. If we're smart, we can get a lot of men to lay down their arms without firing a single shot." Miller whistled low. "Sounds insane and dangerous." Chuck shrugged. "All the best things usually are." The squad gathered later, moving cautiously through the side streets, avoiding patrols and sniper fire. Chuck led them silently, signaling when to pause, when to change route, when to observe. Every step was deliberate. He had learned from Neustadt and the Rhine. Speed and decisiveness were vital, but understanding the enemy's psychology could be just as powerful as bullets. They reached a vantage point atop a partially destroyed building, overlooking a square where a sizable group of German soldiers had set up camp. Chuck counted them carefully, noting their routines, the rotation of sentries, the locations of their officers. 70? 80? Perhaps more. Each soldier became a variable in his calculations, each movement a clue. "Here's the thing," Chuck said quietly, addressing the squad. "If we hit them with noise, confusion, and the illusion of overwhelming force, we can get them to surrender. Not one of us would need to get hurt, but it has to be perfect." Miller rubbed his chin. "So you're saying we trick them into giving up, using their fear against them?" Chuck nodded. "Exactly. Soldiers aren't invincible. They follow orders, but they also fear death. If we can control what they see and hear, we can make them believe they're outnumbered, surrounded, hopeless. That's our weapon." The afternoon passed in meticulous planning. Chuck assigned positions for snipers, suggested placement for sound signals, and rehearsed movements with his squad. Every step, every sound, every shadow would be choreographed to create the illusion of a much larger force. As dusk approached, Chuck moved alone along the perimeter, inspecting escape routes, potential blind spots, and lines of sight. The city, so alive with gunfire just days before, now seemed almost peaceful, deceptively so. He understood the danger. One misstep, one miscalculation, and the quiet could explode into chaos. By nightfall, Chuck returned to Miller and the squad, who were resting but alert. "Tomorrow," he said, voice low but resolute, "we'll see if careful planning beats numbers. If this works, we won't just secure a few streets. We'll change how they see us, and maybe, just maybe, we'll make history." Miller nodded, half excited, half anxious. "History, huh? I hope we survive it first." Chuck's gaze drifted toward the enemy positions. In the dim light, he visualized the surrender, the prisoners filing in, the chaos turning into order. It wasn't fantasy. It was strategy, a test of nerve, psychology, and execution. The calm before the storm was heavy with anticipation. The squad slept lightly, weapons close, ears attuned to every creak, every distant shout. Chuck remained awake the longest, staring into the shadows, envisioning the plan in precise detail. Every element, every decoy, every shout had to be timed perfectly. And in that stillness, Chuck Thompson felt the weight of what he was about to attempt. Not just another skirmish, not just another firefight, but a moment that could turn the tide of perception, turning fear into surrender, and turning a single private into a story soldiers would tell for years. Tomorrow, everything would change. Chapter 14. The legend begins. The first light of dawn barely touched the cobblestones of Koblenz when Chuck Thompson crouched behind a shattered wall, staring at the square below. The city, quiet now after days of artillery and firefights, held a tense, almost eerie calm. Across the square, roughly 100 German soldiers went about their morning routines, unaware of the trap being meticulously set around them. Chuck's squad moved like shadows, taking positions in ruined buildings, behind walls, and in alleyways. Every man knew his role, every rifle, every radio, every flare had a purpose. Chuck's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the focus of someone about to attempt something no one else would dare. "Ready?" Miller whispered, kneeling beside him. Chuck nodded. "Remember the plan. Noise, confusion, fear. We make them think they're surrounded. We make them surrender." From a hidden alley, Chuck signaled the first wave of movement. Gonzalez and 2 other soldiers began creating simulated gunfire, firing blanks into the air while banging metal pipes and rolling barrels across the square. The sounds echoed between buildings, amplified by the cobblestones, making it seem like a much larger force was advancing. The Germans froze, confused by the commotion. Chuck's next move was critical. He raised his hand, and a second signal brought forward soldiers with flares, igniting bright streaks across the square. Shadows danced wildly across walls, multiplied by the smoke they had started the night before. Chuck's mind raced, calculating every possible reaction. He shouted orders, directing the squad's simulated movements, rifles clicking, boots stomping, radios crackling fake commands. The German soldiers looked around nervously, uncertainty creeping into their disciplined ranks. Then Chuck stepped forward, emerging from cover with his rifle raised. "Hands up." "Now," he barked in German, voice loud, commanding, certain. His squad mirrored him from other angles, making it appear as though forces surrounded the square from all sides. The effect was immediate. Confused and frightened, the Germans hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure of where the threat came from. Chuck pressed the advantage, advancing a few steps closer, confident and steady. "You are surrounded. Lay down your arms. You will not survive if you resist." For a moment, the square seemed frozen in time. The German soldiers exchanged nervous glances, then slowly, almost reluctantly, began to lower their weapons. Chuck's eyes swept over them, counting, assessing 70, 80, maybe more. Miller and the squad moved in, corralling the prisoners toward makeshift holding areas. Chuck remained alert, scanning rooftops and windows for hidden shooters. The tension never left him. The war had taught him that luck could vanish in an instant. Within the hour, over 100 German soldiers had surrendered, their faces pale, hands raised, uncertainty etched into every expression. Chuck walked among them, keeping his rifle ready, but his movements controlled. He realized that the operation had worked perfectly. Strategy, psychology, and precision had achieved what brute force alone could not. Miller approached, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't believe it. You did it by yourself practically." Chuck allowed a small, tired smile. "We did it. Squad effort. But the key was understanding fear. Not just ours, theirs." Reports of the surrender quickly reached the command center. Chuck's actions would soon be recognized at higher levels, not just as a clever tactical maneuver, but as an extraordinary feat of initiative and courage. Yet in the moment, Chuck felt no pride, only the quiet satisfaction of survival and the knowledge that planning, patience, and nerve had prevailed over overwhelming odds. By midday, the prisoners were secured, and the squad took stock of the aftermath. Streets once tense with the threat of battle now felt oddly still, almost surreal. Chuck stood in the square looking at the surrendered soldiers, reflecting on how fear could be as decisive a weapon as any rifle or artillery shell. It was more than a victory. It was a statement. One private armed with insight, courage, and precise execution had achieved what many entire units could not. Chuck Thompson had turned a dangerous gamble into a legendary triumph, an act that would be remembered long after the war's end. As the sun rose higher, burning away the morning fog, Chuck felt the weight of the day settle over him. The streets of Koblenz were quiet now, the prisoners guarded, the city temporarily secured. But he knew the war was far from over. The Rhine had been crossed, towns had been liberated, enemies captured. Yet tomorrow would bring new battles, new risks, and new moments demanding the same courage and cunning. And Chuck Thompson, soaked in sweat, adrenaline, and the dust of the square, was ready to meet them. Chapter 15. Aftermath and Attention. The quiet that settled over Koblenz after the morning's surrender was deceptive. Smoke still curled from a few scattered fires, and the distant rumble of artillery reminded everyone that the war had not ended. Yet for Chuck Thompson and his squad, there was a strange sense of accomplishment in the air, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and disbelief at what had just occurred. Chuck walked slowly among the captured German soldiers, counting heads, ensuring order. His rifle was slung loosely over his shoulder, his stance calm but vigilant. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The square, once tense with the threat of bullets and machine gun fire, now hummed with the quiet of victory. Soldiers whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of how one small unit had achieved such an improbable feat. Miller approached, brushing dust from his uniform. "I still can't believe it, Chuck. Over 100 men surrendered without a real fight. That's insane." Chuck shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. It wasn't insane. It was strategy, timing, understanding fear. We created the illusion of overwhelming force, and it worked. That's all. But while Chuck spoke modestly, the news had already reached the higher echelons of command. A radio operator brought word from headquarters. General Patton himself had requested a report on the operation. Chuck's actions, executed with such audacity and precision, were drawing attention far beyond Koblenz. Later that afternoon, Chuck was summoned to a temporary command post set up in the remains of a municipal building. Maps of the city and surrounding area covered the walls, officers moving quickly between desks and telephones. He was led to a table where a colonel, clipboard in hand, looked up with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "Private Thompson," the colonel said, his tone crisp but impressed, "you've made quite an impression this morning. Over 100 prisoners secured without a major firefight. I'd like a full account of your tactics." Chuck recounted the operation step by step, careful to emphasize planning, timing, and discipline. The colonel nodded, taking notes, occasionally raising an eyebrow at Chuck's ingenuity. Remarkable. You turn psychological strategy into a decisive action on the battlefield. That kind of thinking, we need more of it. Meanwhile, word of the surrender began to spread among German ranks. Rumors traveled faster than bullets. A single American private had orchestrated a mass surrender, using cunning rather than brute force. Morale among the enemy wavered. Units began hesitating in their movements, questioning whether they could withstand the Allies' cleverness and audacity. Chuck Thompson, unknown to himself, was becoming a figure of fear, an emblem of the unpredictable, resourceful enemy who could strike anywhere. Back in the square, Chuck and his squad tended to the prisoners. There was no malice, only control and vigilance. Many of the German soldiers were bewildered, unsure how a single unit had so thoroughly outmaneuvered them. Chuck watched them closely, learning another lesson in human nature. Fear could bind or liberate, and respect often followed courage. Miller clapped Chuck on the shoulder. "You know, kid, the word's out. Soldiers are talking about what you did. Some say you're lucky. I say you're dangerous in a good way." Chuck shook his head, looking over the square. "It's not luck. It's awareness, patience, and nerve. That's what survives a war, not luck." The afternoon faded into evening. The square, now filled with captured soldiers, was eerily silent except for the occasional murmur. Chuck remained alert, eyes scanning rooftops and alleyways. He knew that while today was a victory, tomorrow could bring reprisals or new challenges. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small measure of pride. The war was far from over. The Rhine had been crossed, towns liberated, prisoners secured. Yet Chuck understood that his actions had created something larger than himself, a symbol of ingenuity, audacity, and courage. Commanders took note. Enemies feared what they did not fully understand. And among his own squad, Chuck had solidified trust, respect, and loyalty, a bond forged in the crucible of combat. As night settled over Koblenz, Chuck looked out from the temporary command post at the glowing embers of the day's battles. The city was quiet now, but the echoes of strategy and courage lingered. Tomorrow would bring new orders, new challenges, and new tests of skill and nerve. But tonight, one private had altered the perception of what was possible on the battlefield. And the legend of Chuck Thompson, the American soldier who could command fear as deftly as a rifle, had truly begun. Chapter 16. The Enemy Watches. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the streets of Koblenz, curling around ruins and filling the gaps between shattered buildings. Chuck Thompson moved quietly with his squad, their boots muted on the damp cobblestones. The previous day's victory still hummed in the air, a mixture of tension and anticipation. Rumors of the surrender had spread rapidly, and Chuck knew that the enemy would not take it lightly. "Intel says they're reorganizing," Miller whispered, pointing to a group of scouts returning from the edge of town. "They've got fresh units, more snipers, and they're on high alert. They've seen what we did yesterday. They'll be cautious and dangerous." Chuck's eyes narrowed. Danger was a constant companion, but this was different. The Germans had begun to fear him. The one American private whose audacity had forced over 100 soldiers to surrender without firing a single shot. Fear could be manipulated, yes, but it could also provoke retaliation. He needed to anticipate it, to stay one step ahead. The squad moved from cover to cover, clearing streets and checking buildings for signs of traps. Every shadow seemed larger, every sound sharper. Chuck's senses were heightened, a familiar mixture of adrenaline and calculation. The streets, once full of enemy patrols, now bore the subtle signs of an opponent who had learned caution. Barricades reinforced, sentries doubled, traps set with care. "They're watching us," Chuck muttered, more to himself than to Miller. "Every move we make will be scrutinized. They'll try to lure us into mistakes. We can't give them an opening." The day passed in a tense rhythm of reconnaissance and strategic positioning. Chuck's squad spotted small groups of Germans testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. Each encounter was brief, non-lethal, but informative, a lesson in observation and timing. Chuck marked every movement, every pattern, cataloging what could be exploited. By afternoon, Chuck realized the enemy's fear had become a tool he could use. Units hesitated, unsure of how many Americans were hidden, where they might strike next. He began to orchestrate feints and diversions, creating illusions of strength. A single gunshot in one alley would draw patrols away from another, emptying streets and opening paths for safe movement. Miller watched him in awe. It's like chess, but with rifles and grenades. Chuck nodded. Exactly. And the stakes are higher than any game. If we miscalculate, someone dies. If we get it right, we control the battlefield without a fight. That evening, Chuck convened a small planning session with his squad. Maps spread across a dusty table. Markers showing enemy positions, patrol patterns, and likely reinforcements. He laid out a plan for a night operation designed to take advantage of the Germans' caution. A series of simulated attacks, noise diversions, and controlled movements that would convince the enemy they were surrounded by a much larger force. This is our chance to reinforce the message, Chuck said, voice low but commanding. We want them off balance, confused, hesitant. They need to know that every street could hide an ambush, every corner an entire unit. Fear will do the work we cannot. The squad nodded, understanding the delicate balance of their task. Unlike yesterday's surrender, this operation demanded precision and nerves of steel. Chuck had to push the limits of deception while maintaining control, and the margin for error was razor-thin. As night fell, the streets of Koblenz were transformed. Fires flickered in controlled locations, shadows danced across walls, and sounds of simulated activity echoed through alleyways. Chuck moved silently, checking positions, ensuring his squad was in place. Every step, every motion, every whistle and clang was calculated to create the impression of overwhelming numbers. In a hidden corner, Chuck paused to survey the city. The Germans were on edge, their fear palpable even at a distance. He understood the power of perception, how one private could manipulate hundreds without firing a bullet. Yet he also knew that fear was a double-edged sword. If mismanaged, it could turn against them. By midnight, the enemy had reacted exactly as Chuck had predicted. Patrols hesitant, units delaying reinforcements, officers unsure of the scope of the threat. Chuck allowed himself a brief nod of satisfaction. The city had become a chessboard once again, and he had moved the pieces with subtle genius. But there was no time for celebration. The war continued, and the Germans would eventually recover, adapt, and retaliate. Chuck and his squad prepared for the next phase, knowing that each encounter would test their courage, intelligence, and ingenuity. In the shadows of Koblenz, the legend of Chuck Thompson continued to grow. One private had not only captured over 100 enemy soldiers, but had now turned fear into a weapon that could shape the battlefield itself. And as he glanced at the vigilant faces of his squad, Chuck knew the next challenge would demand even more daring, cunning, and nerve. The enemy was watching, and Chuck Thompson was ready. Chapter 17. The enemy strikes back. The early morning air in Koblenz was heavy with anticipation. Chuck Thompson moved through the streets with a heightened sense of awareness. The city itself feeling different, more hostile, more alert. Intelligence reports from the previous night indicated that German commanders had taken his actions seriously. They were no longer merely cautious. They were planning a coordinated response. Miller approached, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool dawn. Looks like they're not just watching anymore. They're mobilizing. Artillery reports show increased activity on the outskirts, and patrols are more aggressive. They know we're here. Chuck nodded, his expression calm but focused. Good. That means they're predictable. They'll move in patterns, reinforce positions, and prepare for what they think is our next attack. All we have to do is anticipate it, exploit it, and stay one step ahead. The squad spread out, securing vantage points and preparing for possible ambushes. The streets were eerily quiet compared to the previous chaos. But the tension was thick. Chuck knew that the Germans had learned from yesterday's surrender. They would not be easily tricked again. He needed a plan that combined ingenuity with boldness, a strategy that would reinforce the psychological edge he had begun to establish. By mid-morning, reports came in that small German units were probing the city in force, testing defenses and seeking weaknesses. Chuck ordered the squad to maintain strict discipline, allowing enemy forces to approach but never overcommitting. The goal was not confrontation, but observation, to gather information while maintaining the illusion of strength. In a ruined building overlooking the main street, Chuck surveyed the approaching patrols through binoculars. He noted their formations, their communication, and subtle signs of tension. "They're nervous," he whispered to Miller. "Even trained soldiers hesitate when they think they're outnumbered. That hesitation is our advantage." The enemy's first coordinated move came at noon. 2 platoons advanced through the eastern streets, seemingly confident but cautious. Chuck had prepared for this. He signaled his squad to execute a series of controlled diversions. Noise from collapsing barrels, muffled gunfire in distant alleys, and bright flashes of smoke from hidden flares. The Germans faltered, confused by what appeared to be a much larger force. Chuck seized the opportunity. "Push forward carefully. Make them think we're everywhere at once. They need to feel surrounded." The squad moved silently, positioning themselves to appear in multiple locations, their movements choreographed to create the illusion of a massive presence. The Germans, unsure of the scale of opposition, slowed their advance. Officers shouted orders, trying to regain control, but the confusion was palpable. Chuck's strategy was working. Fear, uncertainty, and perception were amplifying his small squad's effect exponentially. Yet the situation remained precarious. A single mistake could expose them to heavy fire. Chuck constantly reassessed, adjusting positions, signaling his men with subtle hand gestures, and maintaining control of the chaos they were orchestrating. Every decision was critical, every movement calculated. By mid-afternoon, the German advance stalled completely. Chuck observed the troops through his binoculars, noting the shift in their behavior. Hesitation had turned into caution, caution into fear. He allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction. "They're learning to fear us," he murmured. "Not because of bullets, but because of what we can make them believe." Still, he understood the danger. The enemy was adapting. Reinforcements were arriving. Artillery was being repositioned, and new units were entering the city from multiple directions. Chuck's mind raced with possibilities. He needed a decisive move, something bold enough to regain control and keep the Germans off balance. As night fell, Chuck gathered his squad for a briefing. Maps spread before them, highlighting enemy movements, potential choke points, and opportunities for deception. "They think they've studied us. They think they can predict our actions," he said, voice low but firm. "Tomorrow we prove them wrong. We hit them where they least expect. With everything we've learned, we turn their fear into panic. And we do it carefully but decisively." Miller glanced at him, admiration in his eyes. "And we'll do it again?" Chuck nodded. "Yes, because the second time, they won't know what's real and what's illusion, and that confusion will be our weapon." Outside, the city settled into an uneasy silence. Fires flickered in the distance. Shadows stretched long across the streets, and the distant sounds of artillery reminded everyone that the war was relentless. Chuck stood at the window, looking over the city he had helped secure and manipulate. The Germans were watching, waiting, planning, but he was ready. In the shadows of Koblenz, a new phase of the battle was beginning. The enemy struck back, but Chuck Thompson was already thinking 5 steps ahead, preparing to turn every challenge into an opportunity, every fear into a tool. And in that tense, dangerous night, the legend of the American soldier who could command both courage and fear continued to grow. Chapter 18. The trap is set. The night air in Koblenz was thick with mist and tension. Chuck Thompson crouched behind the remnants of a crumbled wall, peering through the haze at the streets below. His mind raced, calculating every variable, every possible German response. After yesterday's defensive maneuvers, he knew the enemy would be cautious, but he also understood that caution could be manipulated, turned into a weapon as deadly as any rifle. Reports from scouts had indicated that German reinforcements were moving through the eastern approaches, attempting to reclaim control of the city. The platoons were inexperienced, wary, and already unsettled by Chuck's prior actions. Their morale was fragile, their perception of the battlefield skewed by fear. This was the opening Chuck had been waiting for. "Positions ready," he whispered, checking each member of his squad. Miller nodded, eyes bright with anticipation and a hint of tension. All set, sir. They'll walk right into it. The plan was deceptively simple in concept, but demanded precise timing and flawless execution. Chuck's squad would create the illusion of a massive force positioned at key intersections, while he personally led a small team to intercept the reinforcements at a narrow street on the outskirts of the city. Noise, smoke, and strategic movement would make the Germans believe they were surrounded by an overwhelming army. Every detail had been rehearsed. Flares were prepped, barrels and rubble positioned for controlled explosions, rifles loaded with a combination of live rounds and blanks. Chuck walked the route once more, memorizing cover points, escape paths, and firing lines. "We can't afford a single misstep," he muttered. "One mistake and it's over." At midnight, the operation began. Distant sounds of movement announced the arrival of the German reserve units. Chuck signaled his team, and the first flares shot into the misty sky, casting eerie shadows along the cobblestones. Barrels tumbled across streets, and simulated gunfire erupted from multiple locations, making it appear as though an entire battalion was lying in wait. The Germans hesitated. Officers barked orders, trying to coordinate their advance, but uncertainty crept into every corner of the formation. Chuck seized a moment, leading his small interception team into the narrow street. They moved with silent precision, rifles ready, bodies low, every step calculated to maximize the impression of strength. From hidden vantage points, the squad joined in, adding controlled noise, shouting commands in German, and strategically firing shots to simulate a surrounding force. The effect was immediate. The German reinforcements slowed to a crawl, their formation faltering, fear evident in their movements. Chuck pressed the advantage, stepping forward, rifle raised, commanding in clear, authoritative tones. "Stop. You are surrounded. Lay down your arms or face destruction." The Germans froze. Confusion and fear spread like wildfire through the ranks. Chuck's mind remained clear, assessing, adjusting, and directing his squad. Slowly, carefully, the enemy began to comply, lowering weapons, hesitating, seeking guidance from officers who themselves were unsure of what to do. Within the hour, another 100 prisoners were secured, their surrender orchestrated without a firefight. Chuck walked among them, observing the mix of relief and disbelief on their faces. He allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. This was more than a tactical success. It was psychological mastery. Fear, perception, and controlled chaos had done what brute force alone never could. Miller approached, shaking his head in awe. "I've never seen anything like this. You're turning fear into a weapon, Chuck." Chuck didn't answer immediately, surveying the city from his vantage point. The streets below were silent now, prisoners guarded, reinforcements halted, the enemy temporarily paralyzed by uncertainty. "It's not fear," he said finally, quiet but firm. "It's understanding, knowing what they're thinking, how they react, and using it to survive and win." By dawn, Koblenz was firmly under Allied control. The enemy reserves neutralized without the heavy casualties that normally accompanied urban warfare. Chuck's actions had not only secured strategic positions, but had also solidified his growing reputation among both allies and enemies. Whispers circulated. The private who could command fear, manipulate perception, and outthink entire units. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the morning fog, Chuck and his squad regrouped. Exhaustion weighed on them, but the sense of accomplishment was undeniable. Each operation, each calculated risk, had added another layer to the legend of the American soldier who could achieve the impossible. Chuck knew the war was far from over. German forces would adapt, new threats would emerge, and each day would demand courage, cunning, and unyielding nerve. But for now, Koblenz was secure, his squad intact, and his name beginning to resonate beyond the narrow streets of the city, a symbol of audacity, ingenuity, and the power of one determined soldier. The trap had been set, the enemy caught, and Chuck Thompson had once again demonstrated that in war, sometimes the greatest weapon was not firepower, but intelligence, strategy, and the ability to turn fear into. Chapter 19. The Counterattack. The sun had barely risen over Koblenz when the first signs of German counteraction appeared. Chuck Thompson, surveying the city from a makeshift observation post, noticed unusual movements along the northern roads, organized columns of troops, armored vehicles, and artillery wagons. Unlike the hesitant units from previous days, these forces moved with purpose, their coordination suggesting orders from high command. "They're coming," Miller said quietly, joining him at the post. "This isn't a probe. It's an attack." Chuck's eyes narrowed. This was the test he had anticipated. After the successive surrenders, the Germans had regrouped, learned, and planned retaliation. Now they sought to reclaim the city, and Chuck knew that conventional defense would not suffice. The stakes were higher than ever. The enemy had strength, intent, and a single goal: to overwhelm the few Americans who had defied them. "Gather the squad," Chuck ordered, moving swiftly. "We're not just defending, we're controlling the battlefield." Inside the ruined municipal building that served as their temporary command post, Chuck laid out the plan. He knew that a frontal confrontation would be suicidal. Instead, he would combine deception, strategic positioning, and psychological manipulation. Every street, alley, and ruin would be a potential trap, every shadow a potential threat. The goal was to make the enemy overestimate their opposition, spreading confusion and hesitation before any direct engagement. Miller studied the maps with growing apprehension. "They've got tanks this time. How do we stop armor with just a squad?" Chuck's lips tightened into a thin line. "We don't. We make them think they're stopping themselves. Fear slows the fastest tank in the world if the crew believes they're walking into a death trap." As the first waves of the counterattack entered the city, Chuck's squad took their positions. Artillery fires and machine gun staccatos echoed from makeshift barricades, creating the illusion of heavy resistance. Smoke flares turned the streets into a distorted battlefield, and shadows leapt unnaturally, giving the impression of overwhelming numbers. The Germans hesitated. Officers barked commands, but confusion quickly spread through their ranks. Chuck moved among his squad, directing signals and ensuring that each action reinforced the illusion of an omnipresent force. Small, calculated gunfire, loud footsteps, and shouted commands echoed through multiple streets at once, giving the impression that the entire city was bristling with soldiers. Hours passed in tense, controlled chaos. German forces probed, tested, and then withdrew, only to find themselves trapped in predetermined zones where simulated ambushes reinforced the illusion of total encirclement. Chuck's calculations were precise. The enemy could not see the real distribution of forces and was reacting entirely to perception. Miller, crouched behind cover, whispered, "They're actually slowing down, they're scared." Chuck didn't respond. His focus was absolute, scanning streets, adjusting movements, and timing signals. Every moment was a high-stakes decision. A single misstep could lead to catastrophic casualties. Yet his confidence never wavered. By late afternoon, the counterattack had begun to crumble under its own confusion. German units were fragmented, hesitant, and demoralized. Tanks avoided streets with suspicious shadows. Infantry units held back at intersections where simulated gunfire suggested ambushes, and officers hesitated, uncertain which orders to follow. Chuck had turned fear and perception into weapons as effective as rifles or artillery. Finally, as dusk approached, the remnants of the counterattacking forces withdrew, leaving the city under Allied control once again. Chuck's squad regrouped, physically drained but mentally sharpened. He surveyed the streets, noting signs of damage, human and structural, and allowed himself the barest relief. "Every day feels like a battle with more shadows than soldiers," Miller said, his voice tinged with awe. Chuck nodded, eyes still scanning. "Sometimes perception is the battlefield. Sometimes fear is the ammunition. Today, we won without facing the full force of the enemy. Tomorrow, who knows?" The legend of Chuck Thompson had reached a new height. Word of the counterattack spread quickly, not only among Allied forces, but even through intercepted communications from German units. One private had orchestrated the defense of a city, manipulated enemy perception, and survived repeated confrontations without heavy losses. Chuck had become more than a soldier. He was a symbol of audacity, intelligence, and the unpredictable power of one man acting decisively. As night fell, Koblenz was quiet again, but the echoes of the day's operations lingered in the shattered streets. Chuck and his squad moved cautiously through the ruins, ever alert, ever aware that war was not just fought with weapons, but with strategy, timing, and nerve. The Germans had tested him, and he had triumphed. Yet the war continued, and the next challenge awaited. For Chuck Thompson, the American soldier who had captured over 100 Germans alone and outwitted entire battalions, the battle for perception, control, and survival was far from over. Chapter 20, Legacy. The dawn broke over Koblenz with an almost surreal quiet. The city, scarred and battered from days of conflict, lay in a fragile calm. Chuck Thompson stood on a rooftop overlooking the streets, the rising sun casting long shadows across the ruins. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight of what had been accomplished. A small squad holding a city against forces far larger, turning fear into a weapon, and proving that one determined soldier could change the course of events. Miller joined him silently, handing him a canteen of water. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. Chuck shook his head, eyes still scanning the streets. Next, war doesn't wait for reflection. It moves, and we move with it. But the stories, the way people talk about what happened here, that's something that lasts. The squad gathered below, checking on prisoners, securing vital points, and tending to the wounded. Chuck watched as ordinary men carried out extraordinary acts, inspired not just by orders, but by the audacity and calm of a leader who refused to accept the impossible. Each action had reinforced the idea that courage, intelligence, and nerve could compensate for numbers, firepower, and formal strategy. He thought of the hundreds of German soldiers who had surrendered, not to overwhelming force, but to clever tactics and psychological mastery. He thought of his squad, exhausted yet exhilarated, alive because they trusted his judgment and followed his lead through chaos. The war had taken much from everyone, yet here, in this ruined city, something remarkable had been achieved. "Chuck," Miller said again, quieter this time, "people are going to tell stories about you, about all this, about how you captured 130 Germans. Alone, they're going to call it a miracle." Chuck smiled faintly, a mixture of humility and exhaustion. Not a miracle, discipline, observation, and a willingness to take calculated risks, and maybe a little luck. That's all it takes. Yet he knew the legend was already growing. Allied officers would recount the tale in briefings. Soldiers would pass it on around campfires. Even enemy units captured or escaped would whisper about the American soldier who seemed to be everywhere at once, commanding fear as effectively as a commander could command troops. Chuck's actions had transcended simple military achievement. They had entered the realm of myth, a story of ingenuity and audacity that would inspire soldiers long after the battle was over. The day passed with routine patrols, securing perimeters, and assisting civilians. Each small task, each decision, was imbued with the lessons of the past days: anticipation, deception, courage, and calculated risk. Chuck moved among his men, offering guidance, encouragement, and sometimes just silent presence. Leadership by example. By evening, as the city settled into the quiet after the storm, Chuck allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He stood at the edge of a broken bridge, watching the river flow below, thinking about the strange intersection of luck, skill, and resolve that had brought him here. He thought about the enemy soldiers, the men he had captured, and the strange respect that forms between opponents who recognize courage, even when it is directed against them. Legacy, he murmured to himself. Not just what you do, but what people remember. And in Koblenz, people would remember. Soldiers on both sides would carry tales of an American private who had achieved the impossible, whose mind and nerve had secured a city, and whose example reminded everyone that war was not only a test of strength, but also of wit, courage, and vision. Night fell, and the city, battered but alive, lay in shadow. Chuck walked slowly through the streets, listening to the quiet, the occasional murmur of prisoners, the distant sound of artillery still active on the outskirts, the soft steps of his own squad. He understood that the war would continue, that challenges lay ahead, but for now, They had written their story into history. In that silence, he allowed himself a small, rare smile. The legend of Chuck Thompson, the American soldier who captured 130 Germans alone, was secure, not because of fame or recognition, but because of the impact of his actions. Courage that inspired, intelligence that guided, and determination that changed the course of battle. As he looked across the city one final time before night swallowed the horizon, Chuck understood something profound. The true legacy of a soldier is not in the number of enemies captured or victories won, but in the choices made under pressure, the lives saved, and the examples set for those who follow. And in Koblenz, on those scarred streets, the story of one man's daring ingenuity and unwavering nerve would live on, long after the guns fell silent.